The following cases were reported, documented, and witnessed by forensic personnel, yet their official recognition was denied or suppressed.
At 2:26 a.m., in Autopsy Suite B of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner on Penn Street in West Baltimore, I watched a dead man breathe. I do not use that statement loosely. This was not post-mortem gas release, involuntary muscle contraction, or misinterpretation. I am Dr. Andrew Keller, a board-certified forensic pathologist with 12 years of experience and more than 3,800 autopsies performed. I understand the mechanics of death. I understand how inert tissue behaves. This was respiration. The decedent was Thomas Whitaker, a 38-year-old Caucasian male pronounced dead at Mercy Medical Center at 8:11 p.m. from a gunshot wound to the thoracic cavity. By the time he arrived at our facility, he had been dead for over 6 hours. His body temperature had equilibrated to refrigeration levels. Livor mortis was fixed along his posterior surface, and rigor mortis was fully established. He met every clinical and forensic criterion for death. My assistant, Daniel Reeves, stood beside me reading the case notes while I prepared to confirm the bullet trajectory. The autopsy suite was silent except for the low mechanical hum of ventilation and the faint metallic shifting of ductwork overhead. Fluorescent lighting reflected off stainless steel surfaces. Whitaker lay supine on the table, his skin pale, waxen, unmistakably lifeless. I placed my gloved hand against his sternum. He was completely cold. I began the standard Y incision with steadied, practiced pressure as Daniel documented each step. Then, Whitaker's chest rose. It was slow and controlled, a gradual expansion of the thoracic cavity as if lungs beneath his ribs were filling with air. I froze, the scalpel suspended in place. My mind immediately searched for explanation. Internal gas displacement, muscle relaxation, but those do not produce coordinated, isolated thoracic movement. I watched as his chest fell once more, in a clear exhalation. "Daniel," I said quietly, "did you see that?" He hesitated, unsure what I meant. 3 seconds later, it happened again. The rib cage lifted in a smooth inhalation while the abdomen remained still. This was not random movement, it was precise, deliberate. I reflexively checked the cardiac monitor connected to our post-mortem verification system. It displayed a flat line. No electrical activity, no interference, yet the chest fell once more. My breathing became shallow inside the face shield. Then, condensation appeared. At first, I assumed it was my own breath fogging the shield, but I recognized immediately that it wasn't. The condensation was forming on the outside. Tiny droplets spread across the transparent surface directly in front of my face. Warm moisture. The autopsy suite was climate-controlled, dry, sterile. There was no environmental source capable of producing external condensation except breath. I stopped breathing entirely. The condensation continued to form. It spread in slow, organic patterns, as though something directly in front of me was exhaling. "Dr. Keller, why are you stepping back?" Daniel asked. I hadn't realized I was moving, but I was retreating without conscious decision, my eyes fixed on Whitaker's face. His eyes remained closed, but the skin around them was subtly shifting. His lips, dry moments earlier, now glistened faintly. Then I heard it, a faint, wet inhalation from his mouth. I stumbled backward, colliding with the instrument tray. Metal forceps clattered onto the tile floor. Daniel turned toward me, alarmed, but he wasn't looking at Whitaker. He was looking at me. I forced myself to look back. Whitaker's body was completely still. No movement, no sound. The chest did not rise again. The condensation slowly evaporated. Later that morning, we reviewed the security footage with Chief Investigator Laura Bennett. The camera captured the autopsy table, my position, and Daniel's presence. At exactly 2:26 a.m., the footage showed me suddenly stepping backward, reacting to something unseen. Whitaker's body never moved. No chest expansion, no breathing, no visible change. "Fatigue," suggested Laura gently. I did not argue. But there was one detail no one else noticed. At the exact moment I stepped back, the footage showed my face shield fogging from the outside, and in that thin layer of condensation, for less than half a second, a shape formed. A partial handprint from the inside.
When I saw my own face standing over a corpse, it was 1:12 a.m. inside Autopsy Room B at the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office in Cleveland, Ohio. I know the exact time because I checked my watch twice, hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something reasonable, but they didn't. The truth was fixed and immovable. I was looking at myself inside a room I had not yet entered. My name is Dr. Joanna Reeves, a senior forensic pathologist with 14 years in practice and over 4,000 post-mortem examinations. Morgues operate on order, ventilation cycling every 90 seconds, refrigeration units maintaining exact temperatures, and lighting calibrated to eliminate shadow distortion, because predictability is essential for distinguishing evidence from imagination. That night, I was alone. Technician Mark Ellison had left at midnight, and Security Officer Patrick Nolan was stationed 2 floors above, leaving the autopsy corridor empty except for me and the refrigeration units humming behind sealed steel doors. I was reviewing toxicology reports when I heard metal sliding against metal, not distant or structural, but close, followed by the hollow, unmistakable clink of forceps contacting a surgical tray. The sound originated from Autopsy Room B. I remained seated, listening as the sound came again, precise, deliberate handling rather than mere vibration or settling. I picked up my handheld radio to confirm personnel on the autopsy level, and static crackled before Patrick's voice answered, "You're the only one there, Doctor." I didn't respond immediately, because at that exact moment, something inside Room B shifted again. I stood and stepped into the corridor, where fluorescent lights reflected my silhouette on the polished tile floor. The door to Room B was partially open, though I knew I had closed it, and remembered the sound of the latch engaging. I approached slowly and stopped just outside the doorway to find someone inside. A woman in full forensic gear stood over the autopsy table. Clad in a blue surgical gown, gloves, and a face shield, her back was to me as she hunched forward in focused examination. Her posture was unmistakable. She was my exact height, my exact build, and my exact stance. Assuming it was security or an unscheduled technician, I said, "Excuse me." She didn't react immediately, but then, with unnatural calm, she turned. I saw my own face behind the visor. It wasn't a resemblance or a similarity. It was an exact anatomical replication. Every proportion, line, and detail was identical, and my own eyes stared back at me through the transparent shield. But something was wrong. She wasn't surprised. She was observing. At that moment, my radio erupted with violent static, and the overhead lights flickered briefly as the electrical system deepened into an unstable vibration I felt in my teeth. She continued watching me, then turned back to the body and lifted her right hand, my dominant hand, to pull back the sheet covering the decedent. I knew the case. Case 24-2017, an unidentified male whom I had not yet autopsied. She was moving ahead of me, performing actions I had not yet taken. The lights flickered violently and then failed completely, swallowing the corridor in darkness. The ventilation stopped, and the refrigeration units fell silent as the building ceased to function for 2 seconds. When the lights returned, I was alone, and the door to room B was closed. My hand was still gripping the radio, and my pulse was no longer controlled. I stepped forward and opened the door, but the room was empty. The instruments were where I had left them, and the body remained fully covered and untouched. There was no evidence of entry or presence. Later that morning, security reviewed the hallway footage, which showed me standing outside room B the entire time, never entering or encountering anyone. I watched the footage myself, frame by frame. At 1:12:08 a.m., the handle on the door to autopsy room B moved slowly, and the door opened approximately 3 inches from the inside. No one exited and no one entered. It remained open for 2 seconds and then closed. The timestamp matched the exact moment I saw her pulling back the sheet. There was no explanation offered beyond suggested equipment malfunction, but mechanical failure doesn't replicate human posture or observe. I completed the autopsy later that morning, determining the cause of death to be sudden cardiac arrhythmia with nothing medically unusual. However, as I began the Y incision, I noticed something I could not explain. The sheet covering the lower half of the body was already folded back precisely, exactly as I remembered seeing her do it.
The first time I realized the skeleton wasn't alone, it was because its shadow moved when mine didn't. It happened at a forensic excavation site on the desert perimeter of Coconino National Forest, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona, where I was the only person present. I had verified that twice, but the ground-level shadow beside mine moved independently, longer, slower, and wrong. My name is Dr. Michael Brennan, a forensic anthropologist contracted with the Coconino County Medical Examiner's Office. My work involves recovering skeletal remains from remote environments like deserts and woodlands, where I interpret bone trauma, burial context, and decomposition patterns. The dead, in skeletal form, are predictable. Bone doesn't lie, and bone doesn't move. That morning, I arrived at the site at 6:42 a.m. to a desert silent except for the dry whisper of wind dragging across sand and brittle brush. The recovery site had been flagged by hikers who'd noticed partial skeletal exposure along an erosion channel, and as I approached, I saw a human femur protruding from the sand at a shallow angle. Based on the sun-bleached positioning and weathering, I estimated a post-mortem interval of between 8 and 15 years. I activated my ground-penetrating radar unit, a GPR model GX4000, to assess subsurface anomalies, and the screen displayed the expected density differentials of soil, rock, and bone. There was nothing else. I began excavation with a standard trowel, clearing sand from around the pelvis of a supine skeleton whose arms were positioned unnaturally close to the torso. While burial behavior varies, there was something subtle about the orientation. The bones were pointed slightly toward the east, toward the open desert and nothingness. I paused to stretch my back, noticing how the rising sun cast long shadows across the ground. My shadow extended forward, narrow and familiar, but beside it was another. At first, I assumed it was a branch or a rock formation, but when I shifted my weight, my shadow moved instantly, while the other lagged by half a second. I froze, my brain immediately rejecting the observation as an optical illusion or a lighting artifact. I raised my hand slowly. My shadow mirrored me, but the second shadow remained motionless. When I lowered my hand, my shadow followed, but the second shadow lifted its arm, not copying me, but acting independently. I stepped backward sharply, and the second shadow remained in place for a fraction of a second before snapping back into alignment with mine. I turned around, but there was nothing behind me, no person, no structure, and no movement, just desert and silence. I swallowed and forced myself to continue working, reasoning that psychological contamination from fatigue or dehydration can distort perception in isolated environments. I checked the GPR unit again, but the screen flickered with violent static before powering down completely, despite a full battery. At that exact moment, the temperature sensor on my equipment belt began emitting warning tones as the readout dropped rapidly from 82 degrees F to 61 degrees F in less than 5 seconds. The desert heat vanished, replaced by a localized cold centered entirely on the excavation site and the skeleton. My breath became visible as condensation formed in front of my face, an impossibility in Arizona desert conditions. The wind stopped completely, and I became physically aware of a presence standing within arm's reach behind me. I turned slowly to find nothing, yet the shadow was still there on the ground, standing beside mine. It was taller, broader, and its head was tilted toward the skeleton, as if watching the bones rather than me. I realized with horror that the skull's empty eye sockets weren't facing the sky. They were angled toward the shadow, as if positioned to look at it. As the temperature dropped further and my fingers became numb, the shadow leaned forward independently of my posture. Its arm extended toward the skeleton, and one skeletal finger shifted slightly, displacing the sand. I stumbled backward as my temperature sensor screamed, and the GPR unit powered on suddenly, displaying a dense human-shaped vertical mass standing directly behind me before the screen glitched and went blank. Just as suddenly, the temperature rose, the wind returned, and the shadow vanished. The skeleton remained exactly as before, except for the finger that had clearly shifted position. No second body was ever recovered from that site, but the equipment logs confirmed the temperature drop and the radar anomaly. They confirmed that something had been there, standing beside me and the skeleton, simply waiting.
The first time I heard the compound speak, I was alone in the toxicology lab at the California Department of Justice Bureau of Forensic Services in Sacramento. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was a whisper, male and close enough to my ear that I felt the breath that wasn't there, saying very clearly, it wasn't supposed to happen. My name is Dr. Lisa Chen, and I am a forensic toxicologist whose work is built entirely on chemical certainty. Every death leaves molecular evidence behind, metabolites, toxins, or degradation markers, because nothing enters the bloodstream without leaving a signature. That is the principle, but this compound had no signature. The sample came from case number SAC 247712, the unexplained death of a 39-year-old male named Daniel Harper, who was found in his car near the American River Parkway. There was no trauma, no defensive wounds, and no needle marks. The autopsy showed cardiac arrest, but there was no coronary disease, embolism, or anything anatomically capable of killing him except his blood. I loaded the sample into the gas chromatographer mass spectrometer, GCMS Unit 3, located in Analysis Room B. As the machine hummed softly, separating the blood into individual chemical components, each peak on the monitor represented a known substance, like ethanol or caffeine, except for one unknown peak, large, sharp, and dominant. I leaned closer to the monitor and whispered that it wasn't right. I ran the compound through the forensic database, the DEA Controlled Substances database, and the International Interpol Library, but there was no match. The compound existed physically, but not chemically. It had no identity. I saved the spectral data and removed the sample vial, noting that the blood appeared darker than expected. It wasn't coagulated or degraded, just dark. When I lifted it toward the overhead fluorescent light, the liquid inside shifted, not from my hand movement, but from within, a slow internal swirl like smoke suspended in fluid. I frowned and lowered the vial, whispering that it wasn't impossible, and that's when I heard the voice from directly behind me. It was male, calm, and close enough that I felt the phantom sensation of warm breath against my neck. I spun around instantly, but the lab was empty and the hallway was clear. The security badge log would later confirm I was the only person on that floor. My pulse accelerated as my brain searched for a rational explanation, like an auditory hallucination or a ventilation artifact, but then I heard it again, not in the room, but in my ear, through a headset I wasn't even wearing. I ripped the headset from the workstation console, only to find it was unplugged and completely disconnected. Suddenly, the audio recorder beside the workstation emitted a soft click, its red recording light glowing even though I hadn't activated it. I approached slowly as the digital waveform displayed fresh movement. When I pressed playback, static filled the speakers, followed by the clear male voice identical to what I'd heard. It wasn't supposed to happen. My stomach dropped when I saw the timestamp showed the recording began at 2:14 a.m., the exact moment I'd heard the whisper. I checked the room again, still alone, but when I turned back, the sample vial had moved 3 inches closer to the edge of the counter. I knew exactly where I'd left it. The moment my fingers touched the glass, the temperature dropped instantly, a presence cold that traveled through my glove and up my arm. I pulled away as the monitor flickered and the GCMS unit powered on by itself. The mechanical autosampler arm moved with precision, lowering into an empty slot and rising again as if sampling something that wasn't there. The speakers emitted a sharp burst of static, followed by the voice again, closer and angrier this time. It wasn't supposed to happen. I backed away as the waveform on the recorder spiked violently with multiple overlapping signals, multiple identical voices, all whispering. The lights flickered and the air thickened with the smell of fresh blood. The vial vibrated violently as the liquid inside churned, dark and alive. The recorder captured everything, but when the security footage was reviewed later, it showed nothing unusual, just me standing alone, listening to something no one else could hear. The compound was never identified and exists in no database, but the recording remains. Sometimes when I review it late at night, the voice says something new that it didn't say before. It says my name.
The first time I heard footsteps behind crime scene tape when no one was there, it was inside an abandoned house on N.E. Holman Street in Portland, Oregon. The sound was unmistakable, glass crunching under weight, slow and deliberate, moving toward me. My body cam recorded it clearly, but when I turned around, there was nothing behind me except dust, broken flooring, and empty air. My name is Marcus Reed, and I'm a crime scene investigator with the Portland Police Bureau. My job is documentation, measurement, and preservation. I don't speculate or interpret. I simply record physical truth, blood spatter patterns, transfer evidence, and environmental conditions. I record things that exist. This house existed, though barely. It sat isolated between two condemned properties, its windows boarded and its siding peeled back by years of rain and neglect. The structure had been linked to the disappearance of a 27-year-old named Trevor Dawson, missing since November, whose vehicle had been found abandoned 2 blocks away with no witnesses and no forced entry. Until a neighbor reported movement inside 3 nights earlier, there had been no body. Officer Daniel Hargrove stood beside me on the front porch, his flashlight cutting across the yellow crime scene tape stretched over the doorway, and asked if I was ready. I nodded, ducking beneath the tape with the intent of performing a standard documentation of structural safety. The air inside was cold, not environmentally cold, but a still, unnatural chill. Dust covered every surface, thick enough to preserve disturbance patterns and tell the truth of any movement. My boots left clean impressions as I stepped into a living room empty of everything but broken furniture and collapsed plaster. Finding no blood or drag marks, I reported the lack of obvious evidence into my recorder. Hargrove remained near the door while I decided to check the upstairs, where a neighbor swore they had heard someone. Each wooden step creaked beneath my weight, producing sharp, hollow echoes through the structure. But my body cam light revealed a hallway coated in a gray, untouched layer of dust. I stepped forward carefully and began my photographic sequence. The hallway, the doorway to the east room, and the floor surface's intact dust layer. There were no secondary impressions until I lowered my camera. That was when I heard it behind me. A footstep, the clear sound of glass breaking under pressure. It wasn't old glass shifting, it was a fresh break with weight applied. My body reacted before my brain did, but the hallway and staircase were empty. I called out to Hargrove, who confirmed he was still downstairs. I stood still, listening to the silence and trying to rationalize the sound as environmental acoustics or structural settling. But then it happened again. Another step, closer, the crunch of glass unmistakable. My body cam audio would later confirm the sound of pressure, compression, and release. Something was walking. I turned again to find nothing, but then I saw the dust on the floor changing. Directly behind me, a depression formed slowly, as if an invisible foot were pressing downward, displacing dust in a perfect footprint. Then another appeared beside it, a second step, fresh and precise. The impressions were human-sized, an adult male moving toward me. I couldn't breathe, but my training forced me to raise my shaking hands and photograph the active impression formation. The footprints continued to appear, one after another, walking toward me with no visible source. The temperature dropped suddenly, and my breath became visible in the air as a localized, intentional cold formed around me. My body cam crackled with static, and I heard something else, breathing. It wasn't mine. It was wet and strained, like damaged lungs pulling air, and it was coming from directly behind me. I stepped backward, but the footprints followed, each one forming seconds after I moved, tracking and matching me. My radio crackled with Hargrove's voice asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. The breathing grew louder until I felt pressure against my back, as if someone stood directly behind me, chest against spine. I spun around violently to find nothing, yet a footprint formed exactly where I had just been standing. Later review confirmed the impossible. Fresh footprints forming in real time with no visible subject, just a presence walking behind the tape, following.